Hey, Lisa, can you hear me? Hey, Thomas.
Hey, Peter. All right. Man, I'm gonna share screen for us.
Yep, now they should be able to hear us.
Perfect.
Can you hear us on the computer?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm gonna make you both co-hosts. So you should be able to share your screen. Oh.
Yeah, and we were gonna switch back and forth how like Peter's gonna be running the Menti and I'm gonna be running the presentation.
Okay. I think that's pretty good. Okay, so you can't see us right now, but now you can see us.
Yep.
Yeah, there you go.
We are.
Comprehensive operational analysis. So,
Okay.
I don't know who's making that presentation or.
Yeah. Well, if I can, let's just do a sound check. Thomas, you still picking us up? Okay, we're getting now. Now we can't hear you. Bear with us. We can't hear you now. So.
Does that work?
There we go. Awesome. We love your background, by the way, man. Thank you for bringing that today. Okay. So yeah, Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, our item on the agenda here is just a presentation and a workshop around our comprehensive operational analysis. And I guess maybe for the benefit of the group or anyone listening, just as a reminder what this comprehensive operational analysis is it's really, in my mind, a proactive approach to managing the transit system, right? I mean, it's a very similar process that the board directed staff to go through back in the 2012-2013 timeframe, where we looked at our routes, evaluated our current system, made changes to adapt and become relevant and resilient within the community. And we put all that in place in 2014, and so here we are now, 6-7 years later, really just kind of going through that same process, right? Things have changed within our community, and again, just a best practice to see if our system needs to be adapted in any way. I do know the experts at Nelson and Nygaard are going to be doing a few extra things for us this time around, particularly with projecting some growth with the BRTs coming online and maybe making some recommendations, some general recommendations on facilities. But for the most part, we are taking a hard look at our fixed route bus system. So with that, today's workshop is going to include information, kind of Transit 101, if you will, service allocation, and then service design guidelines and service standards. And we'll be relying on the expertise of Thomas Whitman and Peter Soderberg from Nelson Nygaard to talk a little bit more about that and really facilitate and lead the workshop. So Thomas, is this where you want to take it from here?
Yep, it is. So Thank you very much. And, for those, I'm not sure how many board members were around, from 7 years ago, but we had the honor to, do that work, 7, 8 years ago. And we're really happy to have the opportunity again for the follow-on study right here. There's a couple of things I wanted to make sure we cover today. Talk a little bit about the comprehensive operational analysis process, talk about some of the preliminary findings of where we are today, talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs in service planning, and then finally have a wrap up and say where do we go from here. But before I go into the bigger process, I want to start off with a little exercise. And this is something that's a little bit new, and just wanted to see how this works for you, because some of the follow-on questions are going to be using the same technology. We've got a question for you to start things off, sort of an icebreaker. It's what 3 words describe Embark service for you? And we'd like you to enter that in, to use your smartphone to go to menti.com and enter in the code 49255689. And let me show you what that might look like. The screen that you hopefully this will come up, sort of. Little. It doesn't come up. Here we go. The question and the place to enter in those 4 words. I'm going to be able to, show that on screen. This is sort of like a test to use the Menti software. Show what folks think. It's like, what 3 words describe the Embark service for me? And so this allows us to understand a little bit about where you're coming from and what your thoughts are on the service, and also have a little fun while we're doing it.
No, can everybody hear Thomas okay? Are we good on volume? Okay.
So we're seeing some of the words come up, dependable, reliable, convenient, basic transportation, green. So far, nobody said the same word twice. So, like a nice diverse thought process here. And I also want to ask if anybody has any challenges, in accessing this, going to Menti and then 49255689. So.
Sounding awfully quiet in the conference room, so just wondering if we may have lost audio from them again. Just checking.
Almost looks like folks are frozen. So, oh no, here we go.
Hang on a second. Yeah, they lost audio. So hang on a second. We're going to go in and help them.
All right, somebody else, entered in their information. I gotta look sideways here to look at this now. And it's I can't really tell. We'll give it another couple of seconds and then we'll move on to this. But if I think about what are some of the some of the things we're seeing here, essential, alternative transportation, predictable.
Hold on a second, Thomas, because they can't hear you.
Oh.
Okay. Yeah, they can't. Can you hear them right now?
No.
They can't hear them either.
Thomas can hear us.
Yeah, Thomas can hear us. They cannot hear.
Yeah.
I'm wondering.
Which makes me
Maybe Zoom, check out.
Do you mind disconnecting and connecting? Like, can you do that quickly or now?
Here,
What do you think?
there's her external, so you can set it to mirror.
I think they need to I think they need to dump out of the meeting and rejoin.
Just,
Nothing changed on our end.
Except for we disconnected at the
No,
same.
no, that was, we just did it because of the noise.
Okay, so can you hear me, Thomas? Can you like exit and come back in?
Yes.
We're not sure what happened. Like they're using wireless mics, so we don't know if that's it, but if you don't mind.
Okay. We will log out and come back in.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Just try to call back in. Try that.
Okay. Host. So my host is going. I'm wondering if the phone call, like if the,
You guys followed the instructions on how to connect to the
Yeah,
meeting
yeah.
that's taped on the wall, right?
I read them and I just did them afterwards. So we dialed in. I mean, it was working.
It
So
was
I
working
don't know.
and it was fine. They could hear us, we could hear them.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what. Admit. Hang on a second. And then we're going to do more and we're going
We
to,
just want to make this as broad as we can for Justin.
okay. Here, more.
Making his last week worth it.
Has to unmute. Has to unmute. Sorry, dude. I'm sorry. You flipped up on me.
And then we'll need to get sharing back too.
Okay, so it's doing this weird thing where it's not allowing me to make them a co-host. Rename, put in waiting room. Hang on, I gotta go back and use that.
Can anybody hear us now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes.
Oh, we can hear you. We're good. I didn't drop out of the meeting. I just reconnected the audio.
Okay. All right, I think
Okay, pardon the interruption. Okay, Thomas, I think we're back.
All right. I think one of the challenges is that we have lost the ability now to share our screen. So one of the things that
She'll make Lisa will make you a co-host.
okay.
I think it looks like the main larger conference room is currently set up as the host, so it might have to happen from that computer rather than the small conference room. But I think we're good.
There we go.
There we go. All right. Hopefully y'all can hear now and we can hear you. But if I look at some of the commonalities here, improving, reliable, are some of the common, some of the common answers here. But definitely, looking at, what are some of the words: mobility, convenient, underutilized, inconvenient. So there is definitely a range of opinions here.
What the noise is?
So it's just an interesting way to start this. So let me go back to slide and talk a little bit about some of the things we're going to look at as a part of the the comprehensive operational analysis, or OKC moves. What we're going to do is take a look at what is not just the existing ridership and how productive the service is and how on time the service is, but also look at the surrounding context. What is the current and future demand for mobility? Where are people going to and from? Where are neighborhoods of higher needs? Where are areas where people don't have a vehicle or might have greater mobility challenges? And also, what are some of the land use patterns in terms of, where's the higher density areas, and how does the existing service that's out there, how does Embark service match up with that, with some of those land use elements? So we're going to supplement the market analysis as well as the look at how well the existing service is operating with an in-depth public outreach program. And some of this has already started right now, but we'll be talking with you, the board, key stakeholders. We've had operator workshops to help us understand what the operators are seeing and hearing from customers. We've had 2 online town halls so far, and we've started an online survey as well to help understand what are the needs, what are the mobility needs in the community. We're going to supplement this, knowledge with some of the great successes that you've already had in enhancing mobility. When I think about 8 years ago, when I started the last comprehensive operational analysis, the streetcar was still something being talked about. And right now you have something that has driven development, helps, can accelerate the revitalization of downtown. And it's a great success story. We're also, as mentioned earlier, going to be making sure that this plan takes a look at how fixed route service should change with the BRT coming online, and looking even further down the line, how the commuter rail services should be integrated with the fixed route bus service. We also want to acknowledge that MAPS 4 laid out an improvement plan for transit, just from a capital perspective, as well as some key elements from an operating perspective that allow us to begin looking at what are some of the key expansion priorities, where are those expansion priorities, and how do we best serve those. So you've got a great great foundation for success to move forward. Now, one of the next steps after we take a look at, what are the existing plans, what is the market, what is the public telling us? It's our next opportunity to say, what should we do about this? And it's sort of like a jigsaw puzzle with, a series of different ways we can begin putting this together, depending on how big or small some of the pieces are. It's an interrelationship of how much funding do we have, what the strategies are that we can use that are appropriate for Oklahoma City, what are some of the new technologies we can bring to the table, and what are some of the priorities that the region has. And we're going to ask you about some of those priorities, later on as a part of this workshop. There is no right or wrong way to put these together. It's just a matter of understanding what for you and for the region is the best way to enhance mobility for the residents throughout the area. We're going to then take, and ultimately develop a series of different, recommendations based on the technical analysis, based on community input, based on the priorities and the guiding principles that you give us to help frame how far we should go. And we're going to come up with the 3 different alternatives, and then ultimately go back out to the public and say, what do you think? We're going to come back to you and say, what do you think? Do these priorities match with what you said, or which are the elements do you really like in each one of these alternatives, and which ones do you not like? So we can ultimately end up with a preferred alternative that includes as much of what the community priorities are, as much of the things that move the needle for mobility purposes, to come up with a vision for what transit should look like 10 years from now, and the incremental steps that Embark can take in order to achieve that vision. So I'm going to transfer over to Peter and talk. Before we go there, though, I want to just make sure that nobody has any questions. But then transfer over to Peter to talk about state of where we are right now. Are there any questions about the process itself before we move on? All right, Peter.
All right, so as Thomas mentioned earlier, one of the first tasks in this project is really evaluating the existing conditions of the system. And we start by looking at ridership at a system-wide level. So that's shown here in the map on the right, where each of these red circles correlates to a unique stop in the Embark system. And the size of that red circle is directly proportional to the average daily ridership at that stop. So one thing that's important to note is that the downtown transit center is not shown on this map, but it does account for over 2,000 daily boardings. It's by far the highest ridership stop in the system. But looking beyond that, we can start to identify where some of those core higher ridership areas are within the existing network. So a few key locations that immediately jump out are the Reno Mini Hub out on the west side of Oklahoma City that exists where 4 current routes kind of come together and allow for transfer opportunities outside of downtown Oklahoma City, as well as some other locations like the Shepherd Mall complex, the Oklahoma City University, as well as Penn Square Mall. We also identified a couple of corridors that have generally high ridership along their entire length. So those were the 23rd Street corridor as well as the 10th Street corridor. Really where we go from here is using this as a way to identify, again, where those core high ridership areas of the service are, as well as where some of the kind of underserved or underutilized areas may be where people aren't riding as much. And we can use those to inform our recommendations moving forward. So another side of the market analysis is identifying where people want to travel to. So we look at that generally through employment density. And this is shown again on this map on the right, where each of those small red circles correlates to 50 jobs. And what we identified is that jobs are kind of spread throughout the region, but there are a few key kind of employment hubs where we're more concentrated than other areas. So particularly around the downtown Oklahoma City area, as well as around the state capitol and the University of Oklahoma Medical Center. But there are a few other clusters kind of further from the downtown core. That includes the Integris Baptist Medical Center, Mercy Hospital, Oklahoma City, as well as the Rose State College and Midwest City Town Center Plaza area over between Del City and Midwest City. And then kind of up along Northwest Expressway, there's Silver Springs Point and Rockwell Plaza. So we also identified that most of these employment hubs are already served by the existing Embark network. One of the key exceptions would be Silver Springs Point and Rockwell Plaza, which are, again, off of Northwest Expressway, just a little bit beyond the service area. One last thing on the employment slide is that we do note that the Tinker Air Force Base is a large employment area with, I believe, about 26,000 civilian and military jobs. However, this analysis is based off of census data that does not include military employment. So while it doesn't show up with red dots on the map, we do account for that in our analysis. So on the other side of that market analysis between jobs, there's also population density where people are generally starting their trips. So what we found here is that, generally speaking, the Oklahoma City area is relatively low population density, but there are some areas of the city with higher population density than others. And these are generally, again, in kind of the western area of Oklahoma City as well as the southern area. And again, just like the large employment concentration areas, most of these kind of high density residential areas are already served by Embark service. There are a few kind of large apartment complexes located off of Northwest Expressway, which you can see is sort of those darker orange, almost brown blobs kind of off in the far top left corner. Those are currently just a little bit outside of the existing service area. So next, recognizing that there are some demographic groups or population characteristics that make people more likely to ride transit than other people, we developed what's called a transit propensity index. So this takes some of those socioeconomic factors and combines them into one composite so we can view where the concentrations of those specific demographic groups are the highest. So this analysis looks at low-income populations, people with disabilities, renters as opposed to homeowners, as well as households without access to a vehicle. These are some of those identified demographic groups that are more likely to ride transit than others. And what we see is that this generally correlates with the population density map, that kind of the western area and the southern area of Oklahoma City have that higher transit propensity, as well as a few other kind of disparate areas throughout the service area shown in those darker brown blobs. And those are generally correlated with larger apartment complexes that typically have higher propensity for transit. And again, just like the population density map, most of those areas are currently served by Embark service, with those few apartment complexes off of Northwest Expressway being the main outliers. So moving beyond the market analysis, we also started a service reliability assessment that looks at on-time performance for each of the routes in the Embark system. The way this works is that it assesses the arrival and departure time for each time point along each route. And early arrivals are defined as departing the stop more than 1 minute before the scheduled departure time. And a late trip is defined as arriving 5 minutes or more after the scheduled time. And what we've seen through this analysis is that late running is generally a problem, or generally a challenge in the Embark system, with most routes having more than 20% of trips arriving late. It's important to note that really in the 7 or so years since the last comprehensive operational analysis for Embark, Well, the Oklahoma City area has undergone substantial population increases, and with that comes an increase in traffic congestion. So while the routes may have been performing better initially, that increased congestion is causing delays along the alignments. So really our next step here is to go in route by route and identify where specifically along those alignments the delays are occurring so that we can incorporate those findings into our recommendations and make sure that we're addressing these reliability issues. Next, we want to talk through some of the kind of key findings from our peer agency analysis. So what we did here was identify a preliminary list of agencies, generally based on their location or having similar service area size and operating characteristics as Embark, so that we could make direct comparisons between these peer agencies, see what other folks are doing the same or differently, and help to identify some best practices that we can use. So these preliminary peers were vetted through Embark staff, and ultimately we settled on 7 peer agencies, including the City of Albuquerque, Mountain Metro in Colorado Springs, Rock Region Metro in Little Rock, Arkansas, Tulsa Transit, Kansas City, Omaha Metro in Nebraska, and Denton County Transit Authority in Denton County, Texas, just outside of Dallas. So really our key findings from this analysis are that Embark generally invests less in transit per capita than the other peer agencies. This is shown in the chart on the right that shows revenue hours operated annually per person. So what we see is that Embark is relatively low compared to the other peer agencies at about 0.3 hours per capita, while the peer agency average is right around 0.5 hours per capita. So just to reach this peer agency average, Embark would need to operate about 132,000 additional revenue hours per year, which is about a 68% increase in service. Another key finding from this analysis is that Embark and Rock Region Metro are generally unique as being the only peers without a dedicated funding source, something like a local sales tax or a property tax that's dedicated to transit funding. And the reason this is important is because having a dedicated funding source really makes long-term planning and expansion more predictable for the agency. If you know that you have a certain percentage of the sales tax base that's going to be dedicated to transit funding, you're able to really make those long-term plans as opposed to having to kind of compete with other municipal departments like police, fire, libraries, et cetera, for kind of your own slice of the general fund. So dedicated funding source just makes that much more stable and predictable for the agency. And finally, we wanted to include kind of a more direct comparison with one of the peer agencies, which is Albuquerque. And we did this because Albuquerque and Oklahoma City are about the same size in terms of both population and service area size. The key difference here, though, is that Albuquerque operates over twice the annual revenue hours as Embark and has been able to generate over 3 times the annual ridership with about 50% higher productivity measured as boardings per hour. So this is just a way of showing that 2 similarly sized agencies can invest significantly different amounts in their transit service and have vastly different outcomes. And it is possible to invest more in transit and have that pay off in increasing ridership. The last couple points we want to go through on our preliminary existing conditions evaluation is some of the results from the 2020 onboard and non-rider surveys. So what we're looking at here is what the highest priority improvements are for people who are currently riding the Embark system. And the top priority we saw is having buses arrive on time. So this relates back to that service reliability assessment where on-time performance is a concern for current riders, and that certainly bears out in the data that we saw. So other priorities looking at improving bus frequency, so running buses more often, as well as bus stop accessibility, making sure that people have access to the system and are able to physically get to their bus stops. Some other priorities include some more kind of service characteristics like courtesy of bus operators and cleanliness of the vehicles. And finally, we're looking here at the non-rider survey results. So these are priority improvements for people who are not actively riding the system. And the 2 top priorities are having stops located closer to the home or to their destinations. So again, really making sure that the service is accessible to more people, that they can actually get to a bus stop and get on the bus. Other high priorities are looking at employer-provided incentives to ride the bus, as well as faster and more frequent service. So this is one of the shared priorities between both current riders and non-riders, that making sure service is fast and the bus comes more often is a key priority for both groups.
All right, before we move on to the next step, this was a very high level overview of some of the preliminary findings. Some of this may be very familiar to you, and some of it certainly at the rider and non-rider survey might be a sneak preview of a more detailed work that is still coming out. But before we move on, any questions, comments about anything that you saw through that section?
This is Councilperson Cooper. Can you hear me?
I think we can hear you, but it's a little muddy in the background.
Councilman Cooper, you have your, no, I just to make sure the green light is on.
Can you hear me better now? Getting so old where I can't even handle technology. Okay, I guess you can't hear me, you're laughing. Good. What about in other work you all have done in terms of the operator, the courtesy of the operators? All the other ones I'm very familiar with, how we would improve those things. But what do those conversations look like with other transit systems? Is it something we hear commonly, number one? And number two, how does one go about addressing that?
I wish I could say that this was the first time I've ever seen this, but it's not. I would typically say it's not as high up on the list as what we're seeing here. One of the things we have done, I mean, there's things that a planning study like a comprehensive operational analysis can do and it can't do. But one of the things that we do look at is how to, I guess the best way to say it is to improve the lives of operators. And that it's like trying to move away from as many split shifts. Split shift is a fancy word for you come to work in the morning and then you get off work for a couple of hours, then you go back to work for a couple of hours. And instead have a straight piece of, a straight 8 or a straight 10 hour piece of work. We found that, operators tend to like that more, and, a happier operator tends to be more customer facing as well. There's not anything that we can do to say, hey, smile when a customer boards. But the survey results here really do show how important the smile, the friendliness of an operator, an operator is. So from a planning side perspective, we're going to try to do everything we can to ease things, to make sure that operators have a bathroom break at the end of the line, that their next trip on time, so that the interactions they do have with customers are not, hey, you're late, I missed me, I'm late to work now, but instead something that's more constructive. So there are some things we can do on our side, but some of it is also making sure that operators bring a positive attitude every day, all the time, which is a challenge.
Yeah. Hey Thomas, if I can, I'm gonna add to that just to maybe answer Councilperson Cooper's question a little bit more granular with like what we're doing within our agency. So I can touch on two things, and one thing about it is we want to provide the absolute best possible customer service we can. I mean, one of the things we talk about within our department is like, hey, maybe we see more face-to-face residents of Oklahoma City than any other department, right? Because I mean, when we have 10,000 trips a day, that's a lot of people that our employees are interacting with. So we try to hang our hat on that and convey the importance of customer service. To Thomas's point, transit operations, bus operators in particular, I mean, there's nothing easy about that job. Now that's not to say it's a hard job so you can come to work with a bad attitude. I'm not saying that at all. But when he talks about like improving conditions for transit workers, I think, if you're not in the business, you may not realize that, our operators, yes, they work split shifts, which means they can show up at, 5 in the morning, work a few hours, then come back and work at, 3 o'clock in the afternoon till 7 or 8. Their whole day is right, occupied, they're obligated that whole day, but they only get paid for the time they're working. Our operators don't get lunch hours, right? So, I mean, imagine, even if you're signed on to a straight 8 or a straight 10, maybe some 12-hour shifts, you go to work and you don't get a lunch hour. Your breaks consist of basically your 5-minute dwell time at the transit center. And now this isn't like, you know, just us. I mean, this is kind of where transit has came from, right, over the years. So there's a lot of challenges to it from that perspective. But and then the final thing I'll say is, you know, in terms of in this case, courtesy of drivers, I would say courtesy and customer service of all Embark employees. I mean, you know, that's a large responsibility that is on management and the culture that we develop and what we promote and how we talk to our employees. And that's something we as a senior leadership team, as an executive leadership team, are constantly focused on. And one of the things that we'll hit on a little bit later in the year is really trying to get the trustees involved and up to speed on our roadmap or our employee-driven transformation plan, where we've, you know, basically leveraged that plan to develop a set of core values and begin engaging our frontline employees and, you know, really transforming our culture. And it's not, when I say transforming our culture, it's not coming from, oh, we have a horrible culture, now we got to it's just, how do we evolve, you know, from a legacy transit culture, right, into a modern workplace, if you will, right? We have changing demographics in our workforce, just, you know, lots of things that are really, I mean, the reality is we have to adapt and modernize. So anyway, sorry, Thomas, for taking that much time, but I just, you know, wanted to let you know we as a staff are not relying on a planning study to help us, you know, with customer service.
Thomas, I have a question. Would you go back, I think it was Albuquerque, go back to that slide, which was a very comparable compared to Oklahoma City, and what has generated the success they've had compared to Oklahoma City?
Dedicated funding. I can answer that.
Yeah, want more money.
I don't know that he can hear us.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, one of the answers was, you know, somebody did mention it, dedicated funding does make a huge difference in terms of being able to make investments in additional frequency, you know, and they have a series of corridors that are, you know, that I would call high frequency corridor service, coming every 15 minutes or better, that makes the service so much more attractive to potential customers. And they've also, I mean, there's been some fits and starts with it, no doubt about it, but they do have a bus rapid transit, you know, service up and running that they've transformed one of their highest ridership corridors into a bus rapid transit corridor, and, you know, which further cements the ability to attract new customers on an ongoing basis and maintain that high ridership. Some of the steps they're taking, you're taking already with the, you know, the bus rapid transit, you know, investment. But overall, I think one of the key messages here, it's not just about you know, the one corridor, but they've made an investment through the entire region to provide higher quality service, and the market has responded as a result.
Well, when you say the entire region, is that comparable to what we're discussing with, you know, for us expanding out into other cities in the surrounding area? Because there's a big disparity between 2.9 million boardings and 9.2 million boardings.
There is. I mean, you know, the comparable, I mean, I believe that Albuquerque's core area is a little bit denser than Oklahoma City, not much, but both areas are, from a square mileage perspective, they're huge. And, you know, so it is, you know, looking at providing a higher level of service in the areas that can support that high level of service, and then also looking at trying to tie the region together with, you know, so that access to some of the job centers is there, that you may not they've been able to, due to their dedicated funding, to grow as their region has grown. And there's much less areas that don't have service in Albuquerque when compared to Oklahoma City too. So I mean, there's multiple differences here. But it ultimately does come down to they've been able to fund more service to cover more areas and provide a higher level of service than what Embark has been able to do.
Well, it would surprise me, even with dedicated funding and improved service, that we would be able to increase our annual boardings by threefold, but maybe so.
It's and I want to be clear that this plan is not guaranteeing that you will increase it threefold. But the key to why we were showing this is it shows what the opportunity is. You do. I mean, I would venture to get. I mean, if this is I don't like making guarantees at the beginning of a process, but for every additional, I mean, you are still at a point where for every, you should be able to, if you double your service, your ridership should at least double. That's where you are in terms of what the market potential is that's on the table right now. And I'm not going to say that's guaranteed, but that's a rule of thumb that I would use given the service levels that you have right now.
Is their budget twice as big as ours? Is that the 193 versus 404?
Peter, I'm going to have to ask you, I don't recall off the top of my head on this.
Yeah, I would have to double check what their actual funding levels are. That's the number of annual revenue hours. So the cost per hour differs by agency, but in terms of the number of hours they're investing in, that's what that number would represent.
So they're about twice as big budget-wise?
He doesn't know.
Okay.
Yeah, hard to say until I get the cost per hour, but generally speaking, yeah, that's like the double the investment in terms of hours, I could say.
Yeah.
What was, and maybe you already said this, or maybe we don't know, but when did Albuquerque find itself with that dedicated funding source, and did they see this increase in ridership as a result of that funding? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
I don't know. Peter, I mean, do you recall?
I couldn't find when the dedicated funding source took effect and how ridership followed that pattern. No, just that they had a dedicated funding source. And it's in my notes somewhere what what the actual amount is, but I don't have the time frame or how ridership followed.
This data, I think, is going to be important to us because I can already tell you there was a gentleman, I don't think it's a big deal necessarily, but there was a gentleman along our upcoming BRT route who reached out to me and was like, well, I just don't think the city is heading into it. It'll be years from now before we start seeing more people want to use public transit. And I have always believed the very opposite is true, that you have to make those investments to be able to provide those things that those choice riders you just showed us and improve the service for the bulk who are already in that non-choice. But I think that data will be very, very helpful for us as a city because it will help us be able to communicate to our people. Because that one gentleman on Clapham is not alone. I heard that fairly frequently whenever I was knocking doors during my election, and that being to say that public transit was the #1 thing I heard in my board. So I think any data you can get us that helps us communicate with residents here that those investments are in fact what gets more people using, because that is a bit of, I think, a conversation that's here in the city.
Great. We'll take we'll make sure when we document this and, we write up the section on this, that we'll include, this as a call out and provide that information so that you do have those talking points if you do have those conversations in the future.
Hi, this is Meg McElhaney. I'm one of the newer trustees. Does this Albuquerque data include their basically they have a bigger tourism economy there. I'm wondering what that looks like and what the actual demographics look like of Albuquerque, like what their population density looks like compared to ours, their socioeconomic makeup, and kind of how that looks like, because I feel like, well, this is apples to apples looking at square miles and kind of population and all of that. I don't know that is some of the ridership from Albuquerque is coming from the tourism, and what are they counting as their hours ridden? Is it shuttles to and from ski resorts, for example?
I don't, off the top of my head, it's like this is, you don't want to make a direct comparison to say, hey, just because this is this municipality's experience, it's going to be yours. It's supposed to be, again, an illustration of what the opportunity is. If I had to guess, what some of the differences are, I don't know about tourism, but major university is a likely player, in terms of, the goosing of the ridership. And Oklahoma City doesn't necessarily have that, ridership base, to be able to support, higher levels of transit, and with a population that we know can takes transit more because parking costs are, higher, or there's, limited parking. I mean, it's one of the reasons, Norman has a system as well. So it's hard to say exactly what the reasons are, and should you hang your hat on, we want to be exactly like Albuquerque, but I do think that the overall question and the overall answer of, they have made a greater investment in transit. They are seeing some of the benefits of that greater investment in transit. And if we look at some of your peer agencies, we see that same story, just it's not illustrated as clearly, because Albuquerque and Oklahoma City are very similar in terms of at least square miles and the population service area. All right, I'm going to transition into a little, and this is like great questions in terms of what drives ridership and what drives, people to use service or not. And it's funny how sometimes, some of the things we show, are a perfect setup for, the next part of it. And what does make transit successful? There's a series of different elements, and I think we hit upon in the discussion with Oklahoma City. In Albuquerque, there's some definite, definite commonalities here, whether it's what is the density and the land use? What does the built environment look like? What were some of the goals, and when were those goals set in terms of a greater investment in transit? Are there certain things such as high frequency service that, that would goose ridership or encourage people to use service that wouldn't use it if a bus simply comes or transit only comes once an hour? There's a series of different elements that are in play that make it almost impossible to put your finger on just one thing when it comes to why is ridership better here, or why would investment work better here than another one. There's a series of things that come together that allow us to understand what makes transit successful in a community. It's land use and density, some of the best practices. It is funding. It is how supportive some of the policies are for that, and also what your built environment actually looks like. So there's a series of different things that come into play here. And I think one of the other things that's also clear is that, the will I get ridership if I make the investment? And it is sort of a chicken and egg sort of thing of, if I put service out there, is it going to be successful? Or do I need to wait for the land use and the populations to be at a certain point before I can expect that, before I should begin putting out the service out there? It is one of the things where land use is going to be one of the keys to make this successful. And it is a self-perpetuating prophecy in many ways. And I think an example of that, for instance, is the streetcar investment. If you look at what the streetcar has done, it's a quality service. It was built during a time when, do we have the ridership? Do we have the densities in order to support that? And the answer was, I mean, clearly there was something there already. But if you look at what the impact of that has been, it's a quality service. It has led to increased densities, land use, and activities, which leads to more people coming into the downtown area, which results in greater usage of the system. So the community benefits of this virtuous circle where we get the ridership, mobility, shorter trip times, all come together. And what's happened for the streetcar is an opportunity for the transit system, and the regular fixed route system as well, as where we look at where are those opportunities to make sure that land use investments and service investments go hand in hand, so that that convenient, I don't need a schedule type service can drive development, support economic economic development and job access. And we see this as a part of this process, is to build upon some of the existing things that you've done already, such as the build on Oak and OKC land use initiatives, looking at where those opportunities are for service that comes much more frequently. So just like the streetcar, you don't necessarily need a schedule. We want to look at where those opportunities are for the fixed route services as well. And then where the opportunities are to expand access, to provide job access, to provide access to services, to provide access to medical facilities, and do it in a way that folks can make a trip that is reliable and on time. So again, it's not one thing, but what we are trying to look at doing is like, where are those opportunities for that virtual, supportive, mutual supportive improvements in land use policies, land use densities, and the transit, the fixed route service improvements that go along with that. Transit improvements, also depend on a series of other things. It's not just if you will put it, they will come, but you need density, certain densities that go along with that. You need to have the infrastructure, in particular, the pedestrian infrastructure in place so that folks can get from a bus stop to and from their actual destinations. We also need to make sure that anything that we put out there, serves the travel patterns that are out there in a direct manner. The distance and the time spent on a bus matters in terms of attracting folks to begin using the service. And when we talk about the diversity of land uses, it's not just looking at, should we only provide service to areas that have residential growth, but looking at those areas where we can get that mix of commercial, medical, residential densities all put together, so we have these mix of uses along the way to ensure that there's an all-day market for service that goes out there. We don't want to necessarily look at it. I mean, it's an option we'll talk about of, should service only go in those areas where only during rush hour you get service? Or hopefully we'd be looking at finding ways that if we put service in a given area, that there's the ridership demand for that throughout the day. So again, transit service depends on so many other factors than just drawing a line on a map and hoping that things go well. I want to also mention that transit is one of the most efficient ways we can actually move people, as we look at it as a congestion management tool. And as growth continues and we see what's happening in some other cities that were where you are 10 years ago. Look at, I mean, Austin is I know we don't like talking about Austin a whole lot, but some of the lessons learned there is they've had explosive growth, and right now they're literally choking on traffic. And so what can we do in order to accommodate? And transit is an answer for this. And if we look at the amount of space that we need for 40 people in a 40-foot bus, compare that to what it is in a just regular car, whether it's electric or not, or autonomous, the amount of space needed to move people on a bus is less than, the amount of roadway space we need is significantly less. And if we think about from a policy perspective, where do we want to be 10 years from now? This is part of the vision that we need to think about, is like, how can we begin using transit and thinking about transit as a congestion mitigation tool when it's not really thought of that way right now, but it is a huge opportunity that we need to begin looking at. I think Peter talked a little bit about, some of the populations that might be more interested in using transit. But as we look at service as a congestion mitigation tool, from best practice perspective, we do want to look at where are those populations that have no other opportunities that are most likely to begin using that service, whether it's folks that don't have access to an automobile, folks that live in poverty, renters, young adults, disabled, the disabled folks. These are seniors that are no longer able to drive. We need to account for all these when we think about what is the market and what is the opportunity for service in Oklahoma City. I would be remiss, especially, given some of the considerations over the past year, is not to talk about how transit advances some of the equity goals. I think, that, higher transit usage, can result in reduced emissions. And if we think about who are the primarily impacted by higher emissions, it's, lower income neighborhoods and communities of color. And so, looking at anything that we can do and use this tool to advance that is an important piece. It also provides a lower cost transportation option for those who need it the most. If we think about the cost of owning a car versus the cost of accessing transit, it's almost not 18 times, or somewhere around there. It's multiple orders of magnitude higher to own a car. And so if we think about what are the steps to help people get out of poverty, job access to childcare, access to medical appointments, access to groceries, are all things that have a direct correlation between reducing poverty levels and lifting people up over what's out there right now. So transit is a key part of making that happen. And it's also a lifeline for older folks with disabilities, or just older folks or folks with disabilities, and with people that don't have access to a vehicle. It plays a huge part in advancing these goals. And so where does that leave us? If we think about a vision for the future, it's like, what is high quality transit and what might it look like in Oklahoma City? It's and this is hypothetical here. This is not the plan, but you might see elements of this in the future. But some considerations of how to think about how transit can move the needle in terms of mobility for more people throughout the region. That service needs to be direct, serve a wide variety of destinations, needs to have an easy to understand schedule, or come frequently enough that you don't need a schedule, that you have the infrastructure that's there to help the transit move faster, more conveniently, and give the information to customers so that they can make a choice of when and where they ride, and in a manner that they feel like they're first class citizens, not standing on a corner with no shelter, no sidewalk, standing in a patch of dirt. The last piece is making, high quality transit is about understanding, that service needs are early in the day, later at night, and on the weekends as well. So this is all if we think about where do we want to go, this is sort of where do we start in terms of what does good transit look like, and how 10 years from now can we have a story that's more like Albuquerque, for instance, than where we are today. If I think about over the past 7 years, how far Oklahoma City has already come, I want to be clear that we're not starting from a position of, we're already starting from a position of success. It's been gratifying and just absolutely amazing to see the steps that Oklahoma City has already been able to do. And again, we want to look forward. It's where do we go from here? And this is one of the key things that this plan begins looking at. I want to also talk about that each one of the improvements that we showed on the last page, whether it's improving coverage or frequency or how early or late service operates or speed, any one of those improvements aren't necessarily going to say, oh my man, it's like I got to use transit right now. There's different customer values that bring different groups of people together and can entice different people to begin using the service. And if we look at how we've done market segmentation, who responds to what types of improvements, we see that service reliability is the one common thing that moves the needle for certain customer values. But if we're looking to attract new customers, it's not just about adding faster service. It's not just about adding frequency or connectivity. It's finding what the appropriate combination of each one of those is that is, will begin helping move the needle in Oklahoma City. And that's why it's so important to understand what are the local values and what are the local needs so that we understand where that balance is and what that balance could potentially look like. Just got a couple more different, introduction things, but I also want to make it clear, given the huge service area that Oklahoma City has, that having a bus that comes every 15 minutes down every street is not the answer. There are certain land use types and certain areas where a 40-foot bus is the appropriate answer, and a frequent bus might be the really appropriate answer. But there's also large amounts of areas that have lower densities, whether it's job densities or housing densities, that still have service needs, still have mobility needs that need to be served. And we want to make sure that we incorporate each one of those and are aware of each one of those. The last thing I want to touch upon is emerging mobility, and this is like on-demand type services, and this is something that's come a long way. You used to operate something like this for late night service 8 years ago, but this plan is also going to incorporate what is some of the latest thinking on integration with transportation network companies such as Uber and Lyft, or as other agencies have done, operating on-demand services, app-based on-demand services like Uber and Lyft in-house. And then begin, as we look at the 10-year horizon, how do we integrate autonomous vehicles into this? Not just from a individual car perspective of what does it mean for transit, and what do some of those shuttles look like? And what are some of the keys that, some of the peers that, what have they been doing, and what has been some of the lessons learned associated with that? So that's, we've got, covered a bunch of, I sort of call it the Transit 101, trying to set the stage, and wanted to talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs. And we talked, how do we find what those values are? And so want to, understand from you and go through an interactive exercise about what are the region's values. And so for each one of these, I want to give some examples, and then we're going to ask you through that same Menti link to address, where do you see some of the balance for each one of these. So let me go through each one of these. It's like one of the classic tensions in transit planning is the trade-off between frequency and how late or early service operates, because typically there's a limited budget. Frequency is super important because you wait less, you make connections easily, and that another bus is coming. And then if we think about what that means from a span perspective, how late or early service operates is that service, most jobs right now are not necessarily 9 to 5. And especially if we think about low income folks, service jobs, their trip patterns tend to not be focused on traditional commute hours. And so, and most non-work trips also happen during off-peak times. So understanding that service earlier or later is important to job access and other trip types is hugely important. And so again, trying to understand what is the tension, what is more important if we had to invest? Where's the balance? Is going to be one of the questions we're going to be asking you. Likewise, if we think about the importance of operating 7 days a week, if you operate 7 days a week, service jobs can be served, life without a car is possible, and folks who rely on transit have mobility 7 days a week. On the other hand, we also recognize that weekend service tends to carry less people. If we focus only on weekdays, it means that we get the highest ridership, and we focus on those resources during those highest ridership times, but job access and other opportunities are much less as a result. So trying to understand how should we balance those investment strategies is also super important. When we look at how many trips, if we look at the region the size of Oklahoma City, it'd be almost impossible for one bus route to be able to serve all the trip types that are there. And so, but at the same time, we know that folks typically don't like to transfer from one bus to another in order to get from their trips. So we want to, make sure that from how do we balance trying to have a one-seat ride, a longer trips, longer bus routes that serve more destinations. But, if you have a service design like that, it might mean that you have longer, very much longer trips, and the trip times might, is it better to have shorter trip times and more transfers, or longer trip times and no transfers? So that's another one of the trade-offs that we'll want to ask you about. And last, there's another importance of the route directness. If you have a route that makes deviate, and there's two on the map right on the screen right now, there's two different maps. One of them shows more direct alignment, and one of them shows with the red deviations to destinations. And the service that serves the deviations has, some riders get shorter walks, but all the remaining riders get longer trip times, and the operating costs are higher because you're making deviations. So, is it more important to provide better access to all major destinations, or should we be looking at staying on major streets and reducing operating costs and improving operating speeds for the majority of trips? So again, there's no right or wrong answer with this. It's just a matter of trying to figure out what those trade-offs might be. Similar trade-offs are, should we be looking at having more stops and asking folks to have an easier walk to service? Or should we be looking at greater stop spacing where the buses actually move faster, but customers would have to walk further in order to get there? And typically you see the higher levels of service, more frequent service, folks will walk further to more frequent and higher quality service. And that's why some of the bus stop spacing for bus rapid transit might look better, might look different than what local bus service might be. I'm going to skip this, just in the interest of time, but overall, it's the impacts, it's like making sure we understand that if you go for greater stop spacing, that folks will need to walk further, but once they get on the bus, they have a faster and more reliable ride. And the last trade-off is about, I touched upon this during the, should we be operating more service during rush hour and focus on commuters and commuter type services? One example of this is the line 24 between Norman and Oklahoma City, where it's, a freeway operations. It's really for longer distance trips to get to either school or employment. Or should we focus more on services that have more of an all-day market associated with them? Tends to have higher ridership and lower operating costs, but each one of them serves a congestion mitigation goal. The other one serves an access goal. They're both very good goals, but which one of those is more important? So, so I want to ask you to go back to Menti, and that you pulled up for the initial word cloud. And there's a series of new questions on this to ask you to slide on a slider perspective. Where on a spec on the scale do you feel? Do you feel tend to trend more to, greater, from the first question, Peter, if you can pull that up, greater frequency and not as much service, during during the early or evening times or on weekends? Or are you more interested in having greater access, from a span perspective? But what that means is that you might not be able to have as much frequency during the, throughout the day. So again, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's just us trying to understand what the values are and, how important each one of these might be. And we should be able to see as folks answer, where the average is and where some of the, where along that spectrum we might, folks feel. I know this is one of the things that puts folks on the spot too. So it's anonymous, I will say. There's no correlation between who's answering. We're not going back and trying to figure out who answered what. I don't think you even have that ability. And we have 7 respondents right now. Is that just about everybody? All right. I think what we're seeing right here is a tendency, actually a fairly strong tendency, to say, frequency. If we had, frequency is an important consideration, as we move forward here. If we, that frequency is more important. It's not more important. It's like, it should be as a slightly higher priority than improvements in how early or late service operates. We'll move to the next one. How should Embark approach coverage? Should we have, there's a huge amount of service area that's not, covered right now. Should we look at this in terms of having a few, improve access, improve geographic access, but because we do that, we might not have as much resources to operate service more frequently? Or should we begin looking at serving fewer areas, but having higher frequency in the areas that we serve? Again, both very important goals and in line with some of the things that we've heard from an outreach perspective, but it's also a real challenge to try to do it all with limited resources. So just trying to understand where on that range we fall. So, it looks like, so far, 6 of the 7 respondents, also trending toward higher frequency being important, for this. And it looks like even this is a stronger, more a higher tendency than even in the previous question. So let's move on to the next one. How should Embark approach days of service? Should we begin looking at less weekday and more weekend service? And remember the examples we gave, or should we begin looking at more weekday service, but or more investment in weekday service, but less investment in weekend service? I knew one of these would come up where it's like it's really it's like they're both great priorities. So even Stephen right here. All right. How should Embark approach transfers? Should we be looking at saying we're going to have much more frequent service, or may invest in strategies that have more frequent service along corridors, but ask folks to transfer more? Or should we begin looking at saying we're going to provide you as many folks as possible with a 1-seat ride, but you might have a longer you might have less frequency as a result of this? Got a couple more folks, one more folks. somehow it averages out to 5 here. But this is great. This is, for us, a great illustration of how you feel. And this helps us with the values that we don't swing one way or the other as we look at our alternatives, that we find that balance that we've heard from you to give us the framework of how to move forward. Peter, next one. How should Embark approach route directness? And this is a real, it's a challenge. Should it be we focus on less direct service that have shorter walks for some of our customers, but longer trip times as a result, or more direct service that could have longer walks for some customers, but most people, once they're on the bus, have faster travel times?
Mm-hmm. Yep, okay, thank you.
So what I think everybody's answered. Does anybody? I think this is as we think about. I think that was the last question. Anybody surprised? Oh, whoops! How should one more? How should Embark approach bus stop spacing? Should there be more stops and slower service, or should we faster service with fewer stops, but asking folks to walk more, recognizing that the pedestrian infrastructure might not be there and that certain folks might not have the ability to walk further? It's amazing how much faster the results are. The results come in after we've done this a couple of times. All right, definitely a slight trend toward faster, less, greater bus stop spacing. Were there any surprises here? Specifically, if we think about some of the focus on frequency and some of the first questions that we've asked, and I just that seems to be a common theme in some of the priorities right here. That additional frequency is a strong desire. Does anybody want, I don't want to out anybody one way or the other. Does anybody want to talk a little bit about like why they felt that was their priority? All right.
I think
I guess not. But overall, if I think about, there was like from a summary perspective, the importance of frequency and a desire to see improved frequency is a direction that I would, take a key takeaway that I would see from this exercise. And, in some cases, finding a much more balanced approach in terms of days of service, and, how we look at it from a transfer perspective and a type of service, perspective is one of the things that also take away. And then making sure that speed of service is also a key consideration of like, what are things we can do as a part of this process to begin speeding up service? I know we're, so those are some of we'll be summarizing this in a document, but those are based on what I saw from the results, just on a high level. Some of the things that I would consider a key takeaway here. Before we go into wrap up and the next steps, I'm going to be cognizant of the time that you have. Any other questions, comments on this? All right. From a next steps perspective, we're still at the beginning of this process. We're trying to reach out to the public and understand what those needs are. And also, if we look at from a priorities perspective, some of the same priorities, are going to be asked to the public. And one of the reasons some of these trade-offs are so hard is because everybody would like to answer, I want it all. And we all know that from a fiscal perspective, sometimes we can't do it all. And it's one of the, I guess, crying shames of doing service planning is that there's always more need than there are resources in order to accommodate. We're going to finalize the existing conditions. We're going to, come back to you with further workshops, showing here's some of the options. Here's some of the new technologies that are out there, such as emerging mobility. And we're going to begin, after we listen to what the public's priorities are and understand the market for travel and, how the service is operating, begin developing those initial service alternatives. From a timeline perspective, we're still at the beginning phase, the existing conditions, like understanding what the service might look like. In the next month or so, we're going to be transitioning from the listening phase, understanding the system, to doing scenario planning and, looking at the end of summer, beginning of fall to have a thorough community outreach process. We'll be engaging you again to help us understand, here's some different options that we looked at to enhance service. Did we meet the community goals? What could we have done better? What do you like? What do you not like? And use that feedback to create one preferred alternative and one vision for Oklahoma City that enhances mobility for all, that we'll be looking at developing by the end of the year. So we're still at the beginning of the process. If you have any priorities, anything you'd like to see that makes sure that goes into the scenario planning, this is your opportunity to tell us what those priorities are to make sure that we can include those and so that you will see them as we go through the next steps in the process. It's I know it's been a quick hour and a half, well, at least for me, it's been a quick hour and a half, but hopefully this has been informative, and this is really your opportunity in the last couple minutes to say, is there something that you want us to take a look at through this process?
Well, I think one big question would be your suggestions on dedicated funding.
It's I think that's going to be one of the outcomes of the peer analysis of the importance of dedicated funding and what it means not to have to compete with the police department or the library or a host of other civic priorities. So that there will be a section that talks about that in the final, not just in the final report, it's in the initial documentation as well.
I'd like to know how much other cities, our peer cities, use the park and ride system and have dedicated park and ride locations and commuter lines. I think that we've got the one from Norman, and probably not a dedicated park and ride, but at least a sanctioned a private park and ride locations in Norman to get people downtown. Do our peer cities have a greater park and ride system in place at this point?
Yeah, I can speak to Colorado Springs because I've worked there, and Omaha because I've worked there too. There are small park and rides, but not a regional, like get to work type, like some of the bigger, like Denver would have, 500 stall parking lot with, very frequent service to get you into downtown. I think the DCTA does have dedicated park and rides. I don't know about Albuquerque or Little Rock. I'm trying to remember what, so the answer is, like, I don't think folks, most of these cities have big dedicated parking lots, of cities this size.
Okay. Our market research and some of the most recent focus groups we've done have indicated interest in park and rides. I mean, surprisingly, it's come up more and more often. And I know we've provided, a lot of that information to Nelson Nygaard. Along the lines of the chairman's comments about funding, I don't know if this would be helpful or not, but throwing it out here, there's a lot of things you mentioned that comprise, successful components of a transit system. Like, for example, one of your slides showed, covered shelters, or I forget how you described it, but basically, nicer places to wait on the transit vehicle, right? And then in terms of looking to the future, you had shown the possibility of like micro transit, and really even park and rides to that extent. What might help too is like if we look at dedicated funding and needs, maybe identify, important components of a transit system, but where we have funding sources identified, capital-wise. And I'm alluding to MAPS 4. So MAPS 4, we have funding for improved transit stops. We have funding for pilot microtransit. So just to give, I think, our board, but also the public, kind of an idea that even if these things aren't in place, these things we have funding potentially lined up for. These are still, dramatic funding needs, particularly in areas of operations.
Jason, if I leave, are you going to lose a quorum?
We will, but I don't believe we're not going to be taking any action, so we should be okay. So you'll miss the marketing committee? Okay. Okay.
I have a 4 o'clock somewhere else.
Okay. You want to grab a snack? We brought snacks. Okay. If anybody needs snacks between meetings, we've got you covered. We know we've asked a lot from you today, so we really appreciate the time. Thomas, sorry, go ahead.
At this point, it's like it's making sure that there's no other questions, comments, things we want to take a look at as part of this process. If there's any other feedback to help us frame improvement development or improvement strategies or things along those lines.
I don't have any other questions.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, and look forward to presenting the next iteration of what are some of the opportunities and options on how to begin serving some of those opportunities and addressing the mobility challenges and enhancing mobility throughout the region. So thank you very much for listening. I'm excited to help you move forward and look forward to next time.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you,
Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
I don't suppose, I haven't seen where we have any residents to be heard.
No, we haven't received any texts or calls about residents to be heard. No. Okay. No, sir.
Okay. Then I'd say we can adjourn this meeting.
All right. We've got back-to-back meetings, but like I said, if you need a snack or grab water or something,